Handelsblatt. Ich habe jetzt die große Freude, mit den CEOs von den größten und wichtigsten und spannendsten Unternehmen zu zeigen. Und zwar größten, nicht nur unbedingt bei Market Size, aber vor allen Dingen halt irgendwie auch in ihrer Unicorn-Welt. Und zwar in der Startup-World sind sie fast schon, ich sage es ja gerne mal, Helden, der ein oder andere auf jeden Fall. Ja, weil wir viele interessante CEOs dabei haben, ist es natürlich nicht auf Deutschland beschränkt, so I'm going to switch into English. If that's going to be okay. Same goes. Please ask your questions. Ich sage es auch gerne nochmal auf Deutsch. Wenn Sie auf Deutsch Ihre Frage stellen wollen, dann machen Sie das auch gerne. Dann werden wir versuchen, das hier auf Englisch zu beantworten. So, now, we want to talk about the role that European unicorns play in an international world, in an international field of competition. We talk about, are they smaller? Are they faster? Are they more agile? All of those questions we do want to answer. And I'm very happy to have with me today Sebastian Siemiatkowski, he's CEO at Klarna. Nikita Fahrenholz, he is CNO and founder at actio and managing partner and founder at Fahrengold. We have David Nothacker, co-founder and CEO at Sennder. Und Pieter van der Does, CEO and co-founder von Adyen. Welcome. So, the first question that came to my mind when we were speaking about the topic on are you faster goes out to you, Sebastian. You have been called over and over again a payment giant. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah, there's a little bit of echo, but I hear you well.
Okay, perfect. Oh, no, the echo's gone. Perfect. So you have been called a payment giant. Giants usually do a lot of things, but they're not small, they're not fast, and they're not agile. Do you still feel all of those descriptions?
Well, first of all, I'm a little bit humbled when I have Pieter on the phone to express myself as a payment giant, because I think that kind of describes him better. But it's definitely been a key struggle and challenge as Klarna grew from 100 people to 1,000 people, now 3,500 people. One of the things that has been immensely frustrating for me as a co-founder has been, how do we internally recreate that pace, that decision making, that focus on the customer that exists in the early days of a company, and how do you keep that, and how do you make sure that that lives on and that continues being the case as the company grows and you have more people and you do more things in parallel and so forth. So am I satisfied with where we are today? In the last few years, I feel that we have been able to get closer, and we have actually increased the pace, which is very difficult when you're a larger company, because usually you feel every year it's getting slightly slower. But I think we've actually made, but I'm not satisfied. I still think that there's lots to do in order to get there. It is freaking difficult when you become large.
That's for sure. But maybe you still feel just a yes or no question. You feel agile?
I feel agile. Yeah. Yes, I do kind of. I do feel like again, it depends obviously who you compare to. Compared to the banks, the traditional banks, I think I am agile Superman. But if I compare to the startups is where I spend most of my time thinking of competition, then I feel like I am, I don't know, I don't want to say anything. I feel I'm not so agile.
I feel you're in the best of both worlds, because you can feel a Superman the one day and whatever you want to feel the next, so that's not the worst. Before we come to Pieter, because you've just mentioned him also as another payment giant, we actually want to show you a tiny little movie that we made on the topic that we want to speak about today.
For years, eyes turned to the Silicon Valley when it came to startups, investments, and innovation. But that has changed. And it's not just Chinese or Israeli startups that are making a splash. There are also more and more European unicorns. Startups that are valued at $1 billion and more. Many of them offer digital solutions for traditional industries, a huge area of business. And venture capitalists know that. More money is floating into this market. However, regulation in Europe is strict and market markets can differ significantly. We want to talk about how European unicorns are taking on the world and how they find their international place.
Yes, you are taking on the world. I actually really like that saying. Pieter, Sebastian just mentioned you. You're the other payment giant in the industry. Same question goes to you. Do you feel agile?
Yeah, I do. But what you have to realize is, in the beginning, it's not on your agenda. In the beginning, you're agile by nature. Small companies are. And when you're larger, you have to actively fight bureaucracy, politics. And there are two things which I can see that we do about it. One is that we train people that delegated decision-making is okay, so that teams themselves can take decisions and you don't go through a hierarchy. And culture of the people that we hire is very important. So we still see as our 6 board members, every candidate that's hired goes through a board interview. So there's also a lot in the people that you hire. But I would agree, in the beginning it's natural, and now it's something that you have to actively spend time on. Otherwise, you lose it.
Mm-hmm. Nikita, the reason we just started also in the little movie that we made, there is a lot of money floating into the market. That has been different before. It was always we always spoke about it a lot, actually, that European startups not getting as much funding, not getting as much venture capital as the US ones. Do you feel that this notion of being smaller, faster and more agile is actually leading to the fact that there is more money floating into the market?
Well, I can definitely say that I've just experienced with my new startup. I guess I'm here because of my role in Delivery Hero, but my new startup is Actio, and if I compare that to my fundraising Delivery Hero 10 years ago, things have changed quite dramatically. Yeah? So we just raised a 10 million euro seed round for our new tech company, and that is pre-product, pre-launch. Yeah, just with a sort of tech vision and a good team, hopefully. Yeah, so. And that wouldn't have been possible in many ways 10 years ago. So I can definitely feel that things have changed, and venture capital and access to venture capital, especially in the earlier rounds, is being priced correctly and higher, and is very much comparable now to US VC inflows and VC valuations.
That's an interesting point that you just made. You saying like we're actually at the same level that we see in the US?
I mean, I'm not a statistics expert. I don't want to be the head of research here, but it subjectively it feels that things have improved. I wouldn't say we're at the same level, but it's definitely, it has increased quite dramatically, and I don't feel in any way having a disadvantage being in Central Europe and Germany and raising for my company.
David, we have been celebrating in the past couple of months a couple of times that we have a rising number of unicorns in Europe, and that is amazing, no doubt. Meanwhile, it's still just above 60 in total. In the US as well as in Asia, it's above 270. Where do we stand actually in the international world with our unicorns?
Well, it's a very good question. I would say that Europe is catching up. We definitely see more unicorns outside of Europe than inside of Europe. But I think that it is also part of the cycle Europe is going through. As Nikita mentioned, especially with funding availability for early startups, I think we are now on par with the rest of the world. But when it comes to growth, venture capital, I think we're still a little bit behind, and I think unicorns need money to grow and need the valuation. And I think it's more of a question of time. I think this year in Europe, we're going to see many more unicorns being born, but I think we're still a few years behind. And as venture capital comes in, and also money from private equity, insurance company, pension funds, as these pools of capital also get unlocked in Europe, I believe that we're going to see many more unicorns in the next few years.
And that's exactly what we want to talk about. Let's maybe go a little bit deeper into this. Why this year? What has changed so dramatically to the past year or the year before that this has increased so much, David?
Well, funding availability. There's a lot of money in the market right now. I think at least for me and in Europe, from my European perspective, there never has been a better time to raise money as a startup, especially if you're an early stage startup. So I think the funding availability is definitely something that helps, but I also think that investors now realize that Europe can generate unicorns. I think before international investors were looking more at the US and China, and only a couple of years ago have realized that Europe is actually as interesting as the other geographies. And it takes a couple of years until then we see these investments flourish into unicorns.
Pieter, maybe from your perspective, because Adyen is in the market quite a bit already. From your perspective, like how has it evolved, and what was the crucial point so that it now actually, let's just say, explodes?
Do you mean the company or the way of finding funding?
The funding.
Yeah, I think that that there has been a point in time where the US market was way more, there were way more funds available, and all of those firms have opened offices in Europe, either in Switzerland or in many of them in London. So more money came to the market, and when we started to go for funding, it was possible for us to go with the US firms. And usually, so our first large funding was from Index. So that's a US firm out of their European branch. So yes, there has been more funding available. There have been more success stories. So I think it's just a matter of timing. We lag behind, but we go through the same development. Also, what I think is helping is that you now see a generation of entrepreneurs coming to the market who have seen the success of their first gig, maybe not as founders, but then have the confidence to flock out and do things. And this is the second company that I'm involved in. And you see that from this company and from the former company, there are people doing startups because they get inspired. So that's also a timing issue. With more unicorns, there will be more employees who at a certain point start their own thing. So just timing issue as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. Nikita, maybe that question goes out to you directly, because we didn't actually just invite you because of your past new startups, but also the ones that you have right now, which is two, I find, very interesting new ideas, and they seem to be working. So how do you find the difference between founding for the first and for the second time? For you, it's probably like the 16th. I know you had more.
Yeah. No, not so many. Well, so I mean, I guess there is a personal component to these things as well. Yeah. So obviously, with some credibility, it tends to be a bit easier to get an entry into a room and have a conversation. But in the end, it all matters what kind of vision you're selling and what kind of business you're building, and if it makes sense. Yeah. And then again, there is this huge trend of like more VC money coming to Europe, earlier stage, later stage even. So I guess for me, it was easier to raise money for the upcoming companies. Having said this, it's also harder in a way because, it's almost like people are expecting you to be successful. And I just heard from the other gentleman that, they might not want to go through the same path the third or the second or third time, but in the end it also makes fun, right? It is quite fun, right? And I enjoy it quite a lot.
I guess that also is one of the most important part of it. Sebastian, you have 3,500 employees. You work or you are active in more than 17 countries. You're actually a 10-time unicorn. I think your validation is about 10.65 billion at the moment. So you definitely grew quite a bit. What was it an advantage to actually have started in Europe?
It has become an advantage to start in Europe. I think one of the things that I found very interesting is if you look at Atomico, who's one of the VCs founded by Niklas Sennström, who started Skype and actually was maybe the first really big European kind of tech company success story. They've done research to show like what are the most successful places, and Stockholm obviously delivering, massively above its weight. Actually, in number of unicorns per capita, Stockholm is second only to, or was last time I looked, second only to Silicon Valley. And that's not entirely fair, because to Silicon Valley, people from the whole world moved there or had historically moved there to start a company. And nobody goes to Stockholm to start a company, with the exception maybe from Borlänge and Falun and some of the other nice cities that we have around in Sweden. But so I think you got to ask yourself, like, why has there been such an amount of successful startups? And I believe that it has to do with a couple of things. So one is the fact that this idea that US is the country of opportunity isn't necessarily true. A lot of research shows that social mobility is much higher in Sweden, because you have free education, free healthcare. So it gives people the best prerequisites to excel at whatever they want to excel in life, and people take different directions and different interests. So I think that helps. I think also that when I was a kid, and I was an immigrant kid, we know historically that immigrant populations, 50% of companies in Silicon Valley are started by immigrants. I'm an immigrant kid. Immigrant kids want to, prove what their parents couldn't achieve, because their parents change countries. And so Sweden has always accepted a lot of immigrants. And I think partially that's another reason why you're seeing this. And the third thing that adds to that is that when I was growing up, the Swedish government took an active stance and gave a subsidy for everyone to get a PC. So there was something called PC at home reform that allowed my mother to buy me a computer a couple of years earlier than we would otherwise have afforded. And I was having access to internet, and I was having access to things that my kids my age were not in other countries. Plus a very quick broadband build out and so forth. So I think these are the things that's built up. Now, Silicon Valley still used to be very efficient, especially because it was drawing the talent of engineering. What's happened, however, now is a couple of critical elements have happened. Silicon Valley has been so overheated from a talent perspective that engineering talent is extremely, extremely highly paid, and in our opinion, the talent of engineering is of the same, if not higher caliber in Europe as it is on the West Coast in the US. So there's no, that dimension has been lost, and it's not anymore. Essentially, I know VCs that forced companies to move just a few years ago, to move the developer centers to San Francisco. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster to try and compete in that market. So what's happened now is that Europe is actually becoming more and more attractive. We have great engineering talent. And also, obviously, COVID and the digitalization and virtual meetings and the fact that we don't need to be in a physical location will further accelerate the trend that you don't have to sit in Silicon Valley. And then you will sit in a place where life is good and life is attractive. And there, actually, Europe comes pretty good, because we have some beautiful cities, we have beautiful Alps, we have skiing opportunities, we have beautiful beaches, we have an amazing continent with a lot to offer for people that want to have a great life quality and at the same point of time work for great, interesting companies that are challenging. So I think that Europe is on the cusp of getting, more traction, more success. And we've had a fairly liberal immigrant policy, in some countries more, some less, and so forth. So
I was just about to say. Yeah.
And we still believe in social mobility and supporting people when things get tough, whether it's healthcare or education, and give people equal chances. So I think we have put a lot of things in places to be very successful going forward. And a lot of the advantages that the West Coast has had on us are diminishing.
As much as I want to celebrate Europe with you, and I do completely agree with you with all the advantages that we have as a continent, which is beautiful and breathtaking and has a lot of diversity, not just in culture, but in people. And I think it's amazing. Meanwhile, what we also have in Europe is a lot of regulation that also is a problem sometimes for people who want to come and work here who are not Europeans. So, question, like very short question, because when you said the prices for employees, basically their salaries are super high in the West Coast, which is obviously the case. What we see in Europe now is that everyone's looking for the same kind of, let's say, batch of talents, which has obviously something to do with digitization and like be able to write and read an algorithm. And all those people are very much needed by basically all the companies in Europe. And what they do start is they pay more higher and higher wages, because that's what happens. That's how market works. And still Google, for example, pays the highest wages. How do you make sure that Europe's not going to be the second West Coast?
It was that question to me.
Yes.
My God, you put it like the most political, challenging topic. I'm supposed to give you an answer. I wish I could. But, well, I can tell you a couple of things. I can tell you first and foremost, like, Europe has to remove, I cannot understand in a continent that has always been more socialistic than the US, why the politicians and the legal structures are opposing systems that are about giving equity to employees. Like, it's the most greatest concept ever. I want to give shares to my employees, and yet the politicians are doing everything to make it as complex and difficult and expensive as possible compared to the US. That blows my mind. I can't understand why that is the case. So that's number one that still needs to be fixed, which unfortunately also varies obviously per country, and we need to consider what's going on in Germany versus what's going on in Italy versus, like, it's a mess. Like, fix that problem is important. But I would say that, I think secondly to that, I'm actually not that worried. I think we're in a very good place. I think on the immigrant, like in Sweden at least, we are one of the countries that have obviously been the most open to getting immigrants in place. And so we actually have quite effective systems. If we want to bring talent from China or South America or whatever, we don't actually think it is that hard. Like, it could obviously become easier. And we as a big company get a little bit of a better treatment, is my impression, than smaller companies get. We get a little bit more support. We have a little bit more knowledge on how to do it. But in general, like, at least in Sweden, it's not a big issue. We've seen that as we want to recruit expats to Berlin, also quite efficient. More problematic to Milan, which is another big developer office of ours. There, Italy has a little bit more constraints on these topics, but it's doable. It's just, learning and finding that. So I think that I'm one of few, it feels nowadays, that believe in the union, but I still hope it's going to work. And I think that, like, it's a good idea Klarna as a company, we passport our bank license across the whole union. That was impossible before 2005.
I know, I remember.
The banking regulations is so harmonized in Europe. We spend less time thinking about differences between European countries than we think about differences in American states. There's bigger differences between California and some other states in regards to banking regulations. So actually a lot of things has been achieved from that perspective. So I'm less worried about those things. But the equity thing is just like, let us give employees equity, like, please.
Yes, I know. That's been a very hot topic in the past, and I think it does find more and more fans for sure. But Pieter, do you share that impression that the regulation in the banking sector is actually easier in Europe than it is in the US?
Oh, yes, in many ways we benefit from the European Union. So it would be weird from an Adyen point of view to not be a strong supporter of that. And if anything, you would like to see things more harmonized. I also think that we deliberately have our engineers in the Netherlands. That has been an advantage. It's been an advantage of finding talent, and not Dutch talent, but just talent that wants to live here. What I always find amazing is we have engineers from, or in general, people from Silicon Valley that move to Europe for a while and live in Amsterdam or live in Berlin. And you always get the same feedback that in the beginning they think like, whoa, the salary level is lower in Europe, and I'm not so sure about this. And then in Holland, we have a specific ruling which makes your gross and net salary closer to each other for foreign employees. So that works really well. And then if they see their spending power of that lower salary and the quality of life in Europe, then suddenly the whole thing changes. Yeah. And we have a number of people who just want to stay here, who don't want to go back anymore, especially if you're starting a family, and how your children can freely move around, how you spend less time in traffic. Silicon Valley really suffers a little bit from the success of the past, and it created new challenges. Yes, I believe in Europe. Yes, I think it's a good idea to have engineers here. And yes, I think it's very attractive and very competitive. I think we have a great hand of cards there. There's one element which hasn't been touched upon yet, and that there is a trend of companies, large companies move more global. So they don't trade just in one country. And if your domestic market is the US, everything you develop is US focused. And then you have US and non-US traffic. Whereas for us, you build a company from the start of to be active in multiple countries. So we're used to different regulations. We're used to working in different languages, currencies, different cultures. We know if you have a name for a product that you maybe have to think what that means in other languages. And that's an advantage now that the economy becomes more global. Then it's good to have a domestic market, which is not of such a size that you can just build a company for the domestic market. And that's an advantage for the European companies, that if you're ambitious, you don't start just thinking about your domestic market from the day one. You're thinking about, how am I going to scale this internationally? US companies can be US focused for a long time. You have such a domestic market. It's a true disadvantage if you see where the world is moving.
Mm-hmm. David, do you share that impression? Because again, like one of the arguments against it is usually that they do focus, like startups from the US do focus on the US market, because there is, don't get me don't quote me on the numbers, I think it's 340 million inhabitants just in that one market. And for a start, that is a big market. Meanwhile, in Germany, we have 80. You have just bought, at Sennder, you just bought a French company. How does that work for you? How does growth work in a market like Europe?
I think if you look at the European market, it's almost as big as the US one. It's just more diverse, more fragmented. So if you are able to succeed in Europe, I think you learn a lot in that process that then can help you to grow outside of Europe. We just acquired a French company, but also acquired the European operations of Uber Freight. And the reason why Uber Freight struggled a little bit here in Europe is because they developed a model that was very much working well in the US, but struggled in Europe because of many regulations, is different. A truck cannot travel freely across Europe. It can do a number of stops in a foreign country before it has to leave it. And a few other things in terms of how the size of the fleets are, it's much more complex. And I think this to me shows that Europe is more complex, but if you're able to solve that complexity, then you have a real chance to expand globally by taking many more learnings that potentially give you a better chance then to win also outside of Europe.
Then maybe give us a little bit of an insight. How do you do it? Because you are, let's say, in the middle of all the companies that we now have represented. We have Actio, which is comparatively smaller to you, and then obviously the two other ones. How do you want to grow from now on out?
Well, we are currently a European business, and we plan to stay a European business. We feel like Europe is big enough. It's a 350 billion road trade market, so the industry we focus on. And we saw that in road trade logistics, this focus, this complexity that we're trying to solve has to be done on a continental level. That's where we're working for the next couple of years to fortify and strengthen our position as continental champions before then thinking of expanding beyond Europe.
Maybe so. Same question to you, Nikita. How do you plan on growing?
Well, as we're just starting, there's plenty of room to grow, right? I mean, everything that has been said is I completely agree to, and +1, yeah. So I think the beauty is also with our app now that we can launch in many markets at the same time. We are multi-currency, multi-language from the start. That's also, I guess, a learning from my previous companies. And yeah, so we started not a company in 7 markets, I think, in Europe. And for us, it's, we don't even have to think about global presence so far. Having said this, I am actually personally also moving to New York later this year, and we'll also establish actio in US market. And it almost feels like Europe is a bit of a training ground. Yeah. So if you can survive multicultural, multi-currency, multi-language landscape in Europe, you can just rock on in US and have an even bigger market. So yeah, I experience also, Europe being a bit difficult maybe in the beginning, and also like with HR sourcing sometimes when it comes to clashing legal systems, but in the end, a good place to be.
What role do corporations actually play? Or let's say co-working with other companies that have been established longer in the market. You've just announced a cooperation with Porsche, with Fahrengold. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about how that came into place and what role corporations play for your business.
Did we announce that? Okay.
Well,
there was some press around it. So there's obviously, I mean, in Germany we have quite a strong car market and domestic car market and car players, especially for us as a startup in the hardware field. It helps if we can learn from processing quality and quality standards with bigger car manufacturers. And this plays a huge role, especially for Fahrengold, as we're developing hardware and as we're developing new IoT systems. We're also looking to collaborate with other European car manufacturers and developing something there. So it's fundamental to us. Yeah, we're not a pure software app where you can just launch and switch on the marketing channels. We pretty much depend on deep cooperations with domestic car players.
Pieter, maybe we want to talk a little bit more about growing outside of Europe. We just heard, I love that saying, Europe is a bit of a training ground, and this is also kind of what you've described earlier. But now there are markets, maybe that like the US, which is a little bit more similar to ours, but there is also the Asian market, which is not exactly as ours. How do you manage growth in a big market like China?
For us, the Asian market is really important. The Chinese payments market is very closed. So there our presence is limited to helping Chinese companies to sell outside of China. So there are parts of the world where you have to be realistic about what if that's the low-hanging fruit. But we are active in many Asian countries. And it's a little bit like, very much like the beginning, each country has their own set of rules. And each country takes time, so it's not then you wish there was a European Union with where you could do passporting. So that's a really time-intensive effort, but there's a lot of opportunity there. And if you look at how did we grow out of Europe to go to other countries, I think we got My City deal, one of the ventures from the Somewhere brothers. That was one of our first large customers in Brazil, and has helped us a great deal to roll out with a merchant and to be active there. So there's an element of luck in going international. And then for us, it was going to a different continent. We had an office there, but things really speed up if you have a large customer there. And My City deal, later acquired by Groupon, was for us that customer that helped us to on the back of that build a lot of functionality.
When we go back to the topic of our talk right now, the role of European unicorns in the international field, Pieter, where do you see your role in the international world? Because you've just mentioned the market in China is really locked up, and there is big Chinese player coming over the Chinese border into the rest of the world, for example.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference there that we have a very well-developed payments ecosystem, so they can definitely play a role. But the advantage which they had in China, where you can have sellers and buyers and consumers all connected on one platform, I don't think that's happening here. Also, if you see how they look at privacy, the chat app is connected to your risk profile when you buy something. I don't think that's something that we would want in the US or in Europe. So yes, I can see WeChat Pay or Alipay as a payment method. And we support it, and it's being used, but becoming as dominant as in China, I think that's a really unlikely scenario.
Do you share that, Sebastian?
Well, I think that first and foremost, somebody was telling me that between 2005 and 2012, the Chinese representative of Chinese companies used to go to Silicon Valley. They would come on a Saturday. They would book meetings already on a Sunday. They would sit from the morning to the evening. They would sit in meetings, take notes, and do interviews and listen carefully. But suddenly in 2012, they stopped coming. And the reason is they had already learned everything there was to learn. And that, unfortunately, is how I see it. In my opinion, when I look at the online e-commerce experiences, when I look at the app experiences, when I look at the software experiences in China, they are far advanced to the ones that we have in other markets. And I think we're lucky that the Chinese market has become so massive that these companies are primarily focusing on how to beat each other up than thinking too much about how to internationalize their services, because they are extremely strong, they're extremely high quality, and they're very, very focused. Not necessarily, as Peter mentioned, not all aspects of them are necessarily should be or are replicable, but a lot of it is. And so when I look at China today, I think it's the inspiration for where the industry is going, for how services and products will look. It seems now that, we'll see. Obviously, there's a lot of, if you read in the papers, there's a lot of opinions about Chinese companies, European companies, and politicians have different opinions about this and that and so forth. So, and we've seen all the discussions, with Trump and TikTok and that and whatever. So there's also that to some degree, obviously, it should, under all circumstances, at least make it less attractive currently for Chinese companies to come into European and Western markets. But I feel a little bit blessed because I think they're smart and they're very creative people who work really hard. And I think we benefit from the fact that we don't need to compete with them heads on, to be entirely fair. That's how I see it. Now, with that said, I think we can learn lots from them. We can learn and be inspired by their products and services because a lot of them are far advanced and that. So I am, I'm happy if I don't have to compete with them. I hope that stays as much as possible the case.
I'm sorry, I have to ask you a yes or no question again. Maybe you can say yes or no. Does that mean that regulation in Europe actually also keeps the competition out a little bit, Sebastian?
It's a good question. Not necessarily historically, but I think there's a much stronger sentiment today in the political establishment around being more skeptical when you would see acquisitions or companies from those regions invest or take ownership and so forth. So I do think that today there probably is a stronger sentiment. I'm not saying I have an opinion on whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's just an observation of how I interpret the current landscape.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience, and that goes to all of you. And I want to start with you, David, because you were in the transportation business, and I guess that is a question that concerns you quite a lot. And the question is, how do you go about green growth? What's your biggest challenge?
Well, until this year, the biggest challenge was to find customers that were willing to pay a little bit more to get green transports. I think big corporates have a mandate, have had a mandate for the past 3-4 years to become greener, but on a transport level, getting to the purchaser and now telling him, listen, we give you a little bit more budget to achieve these CO2 savings is something that we're seeing only come up now. Sweden, of course, is one of the big markets where we already have multiple customers with green product. Netherlands is the second one. So I feel like it comes from the north to south. And the next challenge we're going to have is to bring transparency on really the CO2 emission savings that we realize, which will be the next hurdle as we expand this business opportunity.
Nikita, is green growth something that concerns you already in that early stage?
I have to say no, to be quite honest. This is not on our agenda. Obviously, at some point it could be, but for now, we're not focusing too much on it. So I can't really contribute here too much.
That's okay. I still wanted to ask you the same question. Same goes for Pieter and Sebastian. Maybe Pieter first. Like digital payment doesn't seem to produce a lot of CO2 emission. Meanwhile, I'm quite sure we have big servers. Data actually do produce heat, and they need to be fed by energy. How about you, Pieter? How do you grow green?
Yeah, so in 2019, we've decided that the company should be carbon neutral, and we have compensated everything from the start. So that includes data centers, that includes our travel. So Adyen is carbon neutral over its whole life so far. But it's not something that is, I think, more licensed to operate for a company our size. Of course, when we were in startup phase, you don't worry about those things. But now with the current position that we take, I think it's logical to do that. What is more interesting, I find, because this is for a company like us, I find it, like I said, licensed to operate. What's more interesting is that we look for services to our merchants to help them to become carbon neutral. So what we do is we have a service that at the end of the merchants are worried that if they ask do you want to buy this hamburger carbon neutral? That it makes the checkout process more complex. So what is more interesting if after the transaction ask, by the way, do you want to compensate this transaction for €1.08 or whatever the amount is? Yeah. And then we have a service to do that just by pressing yes or no on the terminal or online, if it's an online product, you can do that, and that the whole administration of that is separated. So we're looking at technical services without helping the merchant to get that done, without interrupting the checkout flow. So yes, there's a role for us there, we see. So we are investing in that and there's a lot of interest in that product. But if I look at implementations, a lot of companies are thinking about it, but now with COVID, there's so much going on that this might not be the time to launch all that.
Which is definitely a sad thing that COVID actually pushes back on a little bit of that. Actually, a lot of actions from companies have not been done that they were supposed to, but we are keeping our fingers crossed that we're gonna manage to do it very soon. How about you? The same question, Sebastian. How about you, green growth?
But I would believe that COVID, with its reduction of flight, should have some positive implications on the climate as well. Hopefully.
It's a discussion.
It's a discussion. Okay, I'm not going to get into it. I don't have the academical degree to be able to participate. But I think that look, yes, I'm very much along what Pieter and Nikita said. In a sense, I think that like as a company matures and as as we are capable of having a bigger impact on people's lives, which I think we have today than when we were a startup, I believe that it is part of our responsibility to, as Pieter said, not only do the license to operate things like carbon neutral, but actually also consider how we could contribute to accelerating the things that needs to happen in regards to whether it's climate warming or it's biodiversity or other major issues that we face. And so we are also in the phase right now where we have both launched a couple of initiatives similar to the ones that Pieter described, but we're actually spending quite a lot of time currently on developing some new exciting products that are going to be launched this year in this area that we think that's going to contribute. And I think what's important is that you want to feel that it's not just a greenwashing exercise, it's not just something you put out there, but that you put a product or a service or something into it that you really believe is going to work, and that you put the same amount of creativity and love as you do to the other things that we do. And I think that's critical. So that's been important for us to spend that amount of time and love and passion into it as we're doing right now, to really make sure that whatever we do aligned with those objectives really feels like it's going to have an impact and going to work.
Coming back to Corona, I do want to ask you, Nikita, because I kind of feel like Actio is, as an app that has to do with activity, is an app that actually benefits a lot from the current crisis, or am I wrong?
Well, we can't, that's true. Having said this, we have been developing the app for the past year. So I was sitting very nervously and try to launch a product, but obviously I can't launch a product that's not working. So we've been pretty much busy with the product for the past year. Having said this, decentralization, more home office work is obviously benefiting platforms like ours, where you connect sort of a global community to coaches or and learn together. So I think also this will last post-COVID. Yeah, I think there is just this trend of decentralization, and for sure we will benefit. We saw with Clubhouse that people like to connect and that people like to talk, and hopefully Actio can contribute here a bit in the next 10 years. Yeah.
Do you feel like you're going to have a second unicorn very soon?
Oh my God, I would never say something like this. I try to be most humble here. It's amazing amount of work that you need to put in. It's a lot of luck that you need to get. You need to hit timing really well. I'm trying to sort of put the right levers and see that we can make it happen. But this is not my priority one aim. It's more about building an amazing product, and then we see if it takes off or not.
Maybe the last question to make it fast for all of you. Before I have one question for you, especially Sebastian, that I wanted to ask you at last. But before of you, to all of you, coming back to the question that we had in the beginning, do you feel European unicorns are, let's say, maybe not all smaller, but faster and more agile, and maybe thumbs up, so thumbs down? Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you very much already. And then the last question goes to you, because our viewers definitely want to hear that. Do you plan to integrate cryptocurrencies to your payment system like PayPal want to do? I know it's a different topic, but I still thought I'd ask.
Oh my God, I get this topic so well. The problem is, like, if I express an opinion on this topic, I get like chased over internet independently of what I said. So I'm going to continue trying to deflect, but I'm going to use the opportunity that I want once more time, which I really want to raise for people's awareness. And that is, I find whatever you think about Bitcoins and whatever you think about how it's going to work and how it's going to contribute to a better society, what cannot continue is advertising this as a financial investment product with no protection against consumers. I can go on Twitter and I can read, "Are you stupid? Invest in Bitcoin now." If I would write, "Are you stupid? Invest in Adyen stock right now," I would be put into jail for breaching laws around how you promote investment vehicles. That has to stop, and that would also benefit Bitcoin and other currencies if that stopped. That has to stop. That is a major risk that's blowing up right now for consumers all over the world, where people are going to lose a lot of money if that doesn't stop. That's that I'm worried about. And I'm so fearful of this. Like, there's a lot of promise in this with these currency, but it's taking attention away from something that will hurt the average consumer in the future. That politicians have to act on now.
Okay.
That is a problem.
We heard it. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's important to say that. Thank you very much to all four of you. Good luck. Pieter, you're probably going to hit the 2,000 mark with your stock price very soon, so good luck on that. Yeah, you all have very interesting stories, and continue to tell them, because I do feel like European unicorns do have an advantage at some stage or another. Thank you very much.